From last year already, the African Diaspora, along with the International Relations and Cooperation Department, as well as the Dean of Ambassadors, said there was a need for the African continent to talk about an African free trade agreement. The countries on the continent also need to work together to resolve issues around development, democracy, poverty, and boosting economic growth overall. There is also an agreement that the South African government is not only to blame for problems around migration, but that countries must also ascertain why so many people are moving to South Africa instead of equal movement across the continent. The African Diaspora Forum has also written to President Cyril Ramaphosa, who's chair of the African Union, to help resolve these issues. To tell us more about this is African Diaspora chairperson, Dr. Vusimuzi Sibanda. Dr. Sibanda, thank you very much for your time on flattening the curve. Our previous guest has already mentioned she believed there was great cooperation between African states in the advent of COVID-19. What's your take? Do you believe that there has been a great and heightened sense of cooperation on the African continent, or is it still lacking?
Well, look, if we look at what has happened, especially with the lockdown, starting from the time that South Africa, announced the lockdown in about March, we saw a number of African countries, following suit, and we actually realized that, that was taking cognizance of the fact that South Africa is a leading, country in terms of, the African economy, the socio-economy, and related issues. So when you see countries following a particular country in terms of, particular action, you realize that it means that there is, recognition of the fact that this country, for example, is leading in terms of, various areas. And as a result, that on its own shows that there is a desire to work together. So I think that from a prima facie view tells us that there is a desire to work together, though of course there are other challenges, that relate to, for example, testing, because we have had other countries that are surrounding, for example, South Africa, like Lesotho, Malawi, and Zimbabwe, saying that those people that were moving from South Africa are the people that the majority of them were testing positive, for COVID. But now, that, I think, is not sufficient. It doesn't really show the cooperation, because it might actually mean that the majority of these countries are only focusing on testing people that are coming from South Africa, but may not necessarily be testing people within their countries. Because this is not a competition really to say, this country has got so many people that have tested, but it's actually to try and get the correct view and state of affairs on the ground as far as COVID is concerned. It's not about who has got so many, positive tests, or to try and give, a false reflection of what is happening. So I think South Africa is doing quite well in terms of the test and intensifying to try and curb. And I think that to do a lot better if all the other countries would follow suit and, where possible, enlist the services of South Africa in terms of advice, where we can have meetings, for example, like what we had with the AU, where SADC, for example, also, maybe sit with South Africa to say what exactly is happening, what can be done, how can we work together, rather than, I know that in Zambia at some stage, we had drivers that were coming only from South Africa being exposed, to, the test, while at least, I think, the assertion was that people in Zambia were not being tested, and it appeared as if it was only, discriminating the drivers, the drivers that were traveling long distance, bringing food into Zambia and DRC. And I think that is not the spirit of cooperation that we're really talking about. We're talking about genuine, bona fide and committed, working together in collaboration to see where, for example, the weaknesses, where the problems could be, to such an extent that even the countries that are misappropriating funds that are being brought into countries to fight COVID can also be taken to task, and also that quarantine facilities, there could be a working together to ensure that the facilities in all the countries in Africa are up to standard, so that people don't feel, that, being quarantined in any case, it's actually denigrating them, or it is against their human dignity because of the conditions.
Dr. Sibanda, the African Diaspora has been at pains to say that migration is a big issue on the African continent, and an issue that you've taken up with the South African government. How do you think that the continent's addressing of this issue is going to be affected by the fact that so many countries have closed their borders in attempts to try and ensure that COVID-19 is kept under control? Do you think that the attempts to try and and ensure that there's better movement across the African continent is going to be set back a good couple of years?
Well, I think that as far as we have got COVID, one of the basic, obviously, means of trying to control, COVID is to limit the amount of movement of people, which is also happening at within particular regions, within countries, like what we see happening in South Africa, where people are not moving just unnecessarily, within provinces. But when you look at the problem of, for example, migration, it does not follow that because countries are saying people should not move. It doesn't follow that, people are not crossing into South Africa because people are generally starving, in these countries, and they will continue to trek down into South Africa through undesignated, ports of entry or points of entry into South Africa. And what that means is that because a lot of the countries in Africa are having serious problems, with starvation, hunger, democratic problems, political problems, it simply means that those people are going to continue again coming down into South Africa, where they'll also come and find that levels of, unemployment, especially due to COVID, are relatively, of unemployment rather, are quite low. If we take into cognizance the speech of the Minister of Finance, which showed that at the moment employment is already sitting at 30 point something, which is much higher than what it was before COVID, it is obviously telling us that the problem is going to continue and it's going to intensify and become worse. But if, African countries can decide to work together and discuss the issues that lead to migration and why a lot of people are trekking down into South Africa and how these can be ameliorated by the intervention of ensuring that, democratic practices, socioeconomic conditions, poverty and other related issues are dealt with in these countries, I think that would definitely help in the long run.
What about the plight of refugees, not only here in South Africa, but other African states that have found themselves at a complete loss with the advent of COVID-19? We've seen communities of refugees in all big city centres around South Africa, Cape Town being one that springs to mind. What future do they have to look forward to, with many of them asking to be returned to their country of origin or indeed any other country that will take them?
Very unfortunately, I think the issue of refugees is one of the biggest problems, because we have seen that, I think in about 2 weeks ago, we saw that the de facto refugees, which include asylum seekers who, for example, had applied or not yet applied, or who were still waiting the determination of their status as refugees, was quite indeterminate in the sense that they had not been covered by, the government endeavors to try and lessen the severity of starvation and hunger and accommodation. Now, what that means across the African countries, because of the major problem of starvation and poverty, a lot of governments are not taking into cognizance the plight of refugees. And what that means is that refugees are going to find themselves having to move unnecessarily, or go out to try and fend for their families. And that on its own becomes a serious problem, because their human dignity is obviously impaired, and their ability to survive is obviously, also put under serious challenge or threat. We will also see that a lot of people that are arrested in the prison at this particular stage are people that, for example, are refugees or asylum seekers whose papers might have expired and some are not expired. And when they get arrested, for example, when we're in lockdown level 4, when they were arrested for violating regulations of DMA, they were not even given, for example, bail, because their papers had to be verified first, despite the fact that they could be carrying the papers, but the papers had to be taken to Home Affairs. And that's only not a South African problem, but it is a problem that we're looking at, across the continent, where even during this lockdown, we see people being deported. While we're saying there should be at least no movement, unnecessary movement. Now, if we start exchanging these people, that are refugees or de facto asylum seekers, and it means that we are not really flattening, the curve, in the sense that we are still, moving people unnecessarily.
Dr. Sibanda, has the South African government made good on promises of assistance to the various communities of refugees that you've identified in your talks with them, in terms of financial support and otherwise?
Well, look, there is a huge challenge there. One of the issues that we are very grateful to is that, from the onset, for example, the refugees were included, in the food parcels and even in the SRD, relief grants. But of course, the asylum seekers, had been left outside, including the special dispensation permit, where we had to get, the court. One of the issues that we are coming across as far as the South African government is concerned, it has been the implementation of, the regulations and the determination on how, these groups of migrants in the country are being dealt with. Because a lot of them that are supposed to be receiving TERS, that is in terms of UIF, have still not received it, despite the fact that they've applied. We have seen groups of people that are employed, and the regulations, basically stated that as long as someone is employed and you're a worker, if you can show that you're a worker, you'll be, given, you will be included in the UIF, TERS. But we've seen a lot of migrants that are coming through and saying, the company has not registered us, but we are employees and we have applied to UIF and UIF has declined us. So unfortunately, it looks like it is very slow, and in some cases it is not effective, or whatever that has been said has not been implemented and is not being implemented at all.
We'll have to leave it at that. African Diaspora Chairperson, Dr. Vusimuzi Sibanda, thank you for your time on flattening the curve.